Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Behind Every Drug, There is a Story, bringing the human experience back into drug development. Today, we are particularly honored to have Dr. William Pao with us. And I'm going to take a couple of moments to summarize his extensive career and experience. Dr. William Pao did his medical school and PhD at Yale University, and then residency at Weill Cornell Medical School, and postdoctoral fellowship with Harold E. Varmus at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Then he did his start of career at Sloan Kettering before he joined the Vanderbilt University as the professor in the Division of Hematology and Oncology, and then became the head of the Division of Personalized Cancer Medicine. Then he joined Roche. He was the head of oncology and pharma research and early development, better known as PRED at Roche. And afterwards, Executive Vice President and Chief Development Officer of Pfizer. He is currently the Chief Executive Officer of a pharma company in the US. And honestly, this is such an honor, and I am thrilled to have you joining us for this edition of Behind Every Drug, There is a Story, because in addition to all of what I've just said, you're also an author of a book that is called Breakthrough: The Quest for Life-Changing Medicines. And it is such an incredible read, and I can't wait to dive into it more in this conversation. So William, welcome.
Alex, thanks a lot for the opportunity. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So this extensive career of yours, tell me the highlights for you.
Yeah, so, it's been quite a journey. I've been in academia, I've been in pharma, and then now in biotech. And I would say I've loved every minute of every part of the way. It's really, an open learning process, and all of it really using science to better the lives of patients, for example, of those with patients with cancer. I would say there's been many highlights, some lowlights also, but the highlights are usually ones that, where there's been some kind of breakthrough, either in the lab or clinically for patients, that ultimately has led to big benefit for patients worldwide.
Incredible. You've mentioned the highs, and also you've mentioned the lowlights. Do you see these going hand in hand always? Can one have a career with just one and not the other?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think you need rain to appreciate the sun. And unfortunately, life always has its ups and downs. But I think the stories that I tell in the book, for example, really highlight determination and resilience, because basically every scientific project that we all work on, we just don't understand enough about the human body and about nature. So there's always going to be dead ends. There's always going to be failures. But if we turn those failures into successes and we learn from those failures, I think we can succeed. So yeah, for sure, I think every highlight comes with a low light, and it's those who can pick themselves up with resilience and determination and keep going that can ultimately succeed.
Absolutely. And that's such an important message, really, for everyone who's even remotely interested and certainly involved in leading drug development. It's such an important message. So I would love to use your book as a springboard for this conversation. And, the quote from Sid Mukherjee, who's the Pulitzer Prize winner and our colleague, says a must read. And it truly, truly is a must read. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know that I will be going back to it. Now, William, you say here, to my dad who died too young. So the dedication of this book is to your father. And I hope you don't mind, but I would really, really love to rewind the clock back into your childhood, into your formative years. And as much as you're comfortable sharing with us, and given that you've dedicated this book to your dad, Can you tell us a little bit about him, perhaps, and also you as the younger you, and how those formative years may have shaped your choices to ultimately venture into this career and really to have and hold such passion for it?
So thanks for picking up that I dedicated the book to my father. He died basically at age 59 from colon cancer. So basically, he originally came from Shanghai, China, to do residency in America, and basically, actually became a psychoanalyst, which must have been very rare at the time for a Chinese person growing up in China to come to America and then become a psychoanalyst, psychiatrist. But he eventually headed up, he was the director of psychotherapy at Chestnut Lodge, which was a private mental hospital in the Maryland area. But then I was, I think, 11 when unfortunately he came down with colon cancer. I wasn't told very much actually, and didn't know much about what was going on. But he went to surgery and then had to get chemo. And I remember his hair falling out, and we used to go get our haircuts every week, not every week, every month, and that stopped for a while because he lost his hair. But he did recover, and so I thought everything was going to be fine. But then 2 years later, he unfortunately had recurrence, and then unexpectedly died while getting biopsied in the operating room to establish the recurrence. So I was 13 at the time, and really didn't know, how I would make an impact. But I did vow at that time that I would try to make a difference for patients like him. And then ultimately, I didn't know what that path was going to be. But as you mentioned in my background, that I ended up getting an MD PhD and then doing cancer research and then ultimately doing drug development for patients, to develop new drugs in cancer and then ultimately for other areas as well. But that's really motivated me throughout my life. And then also because of that, I also have something called the grandma test. I should say father test, but it's grandma test, which is, if you have a trial and then you have a relative like your grandmother, you better be so confident about it or about its safety and potential benefit that you'd be willing to put your own relative on that trial.
Absolutely, yes, and that's such a good way of looking at it. And also, thank you for sharing the story of your dad and that experience when you were really so young. And I just wanted to highlight for everyone who's watching and listening how important those moments in time when we're younger can be to shape how we ultimately end up showing up in the world, in our profession or otherwise, and those passions that we hold to solve problems for our younger selves, but then ultimately for the world, because so many of us really are facing many of the same problems, if not for ourselves, then for our loved ones. And how your career has now touched millions of people, really, through all of the drug development ventures that you've been involved with, and how your dad served as a motivation for that. Really beautiful story.
Oh, thanks. And you'll see in the book, there's many people who have similar stories, unfortunately.
Yes.
Had a relative or a friend that had some kind of disease, which ultimately motivated them to make a difference.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you've seen so much in your career. You've worked for years in academia. You've led groups within the academia and hospitals in precision medicine. You're one of the pioneers in the research of tyrosine kinases and tyrosine kinase inhibitors. A lot of focus on EGFR as well. You've made significant breakthroughs there in your career. And you've worked for Big Pharma, for Roche, for Pfizer. You have held hands of so many drug development programs. What has motivated you to write this book now?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Alex. So the original genesis of the book actually started during COVID, but was also motivated by the fact that one of the molecules coming from Roche PRED, Roche Pharma Research Early Development, risdiplam, was about to get launched. And when a medicine gets launched, there's a big news release, but none of the scientists who contributed to that development really get recognized. And I was thinking, when a medicine actually gets launched, it's actually a really big deal. It's very hard to ever launch a medicine, as many of us know. And throughout history, actually, by the end of December 2022, there's only 1,800 new molecular entities ever been approved by regulatory agencies in human history. So it's pretty rare. I think 1,800 is not very many.
True.
So I wanted to highlight the unsung heroes behind the discovery of the molecule risdiplam, because I know many people are slogging every day to work really, really hard in the lab and also in the clinic to try to, make a difference. But their recognition is, they're not well recognized, and their stories sort of get lost. So that was the original motivation. The medicine was about to get launched, wanted to highlight the unsung heroes. And then also because of COVID, I had a little bit of extra time. Then what happened also was, because I was heading up Roche Pharma Research Early Development, I was trying to read a lot of books about innovation. And you may know that when you look for books about innovation, they're usually about electric cars, iPhones, going to the moon, and so on. There's not a lot about innovation in drug development. And in particular, I think innovation in drug development is even tougher because unlike an iPhone, which you don't have to put in your body, a medicine has to go in the body and not kill somebody too at the same time. So putting that all together, then I decided that it was worth writing a story about innovation in drug discovery. Then the second part of that is, after I had written a chapter on risdiplam, which is the molecule for spinal muscular atrophy, people liked it. And so I thought, let's, maybe I should write another chapter or even more. And at that time, because I was at Roche, I thought, well, if I write all about Roche molecules, then people will think I'm just advertising for my company. So I decided to email my colleagues and friends across the industry, heads of R&D, et cetera, and ask them if they'd be willing to contribute a molecule from their company. And I thought they would say no, but to my surprise, they actually said yes. So you'll see in the book, there's molecules from Gilead, AstraZeneca, Novartis, Pfizer, and so on. And so it's about multiple molecules from different companies, and I got access to the scientists in those companies as well.
That's really incredible, and it speaks to how timely the book is, and also how much these stories want to be told. As you shared, you thought your colleagues would say no, and then everyone said yes. And when you and I spoke in London a few weeks ago, you've mentioned that there were also some stories that didn't even make it into the book. So maybe there's going to be a sequel, we're hoping. But so many stories, so many unsung heroes, and you've done them such justice and written about them so beautifully here. There are 8 stories. They span across different disease indications, not just oncology. So I'm curious, if you were to pull a through line through all of them, and those that haven't yet made it into a book that you have received from your colleagues, what would you say are the common features amongst these stories?
Yeah, so I do in that last chapter have a chapter about 10 insights that have been gleaned from the 8 different molecules. However, and I probably don't want to go through all 10 now, but I would just highlight 2. I think one we talked about already, right, which is the resilience and determination. In every one of the stories, and I think all of us working in drug development, we all know that there's a moment or many moments when you think the program might be dead. Or on its way to not being successful. And it's really then picking yourself up, learning from the process, learning what's not going well, and maybe how to pivot, that really makes a huge difference. The second thing I would say is, drug development takes a long time. Many people, particularly consultants, like to think that you can, just be more efficient in drug development. But you'll see from the chapters that, some of the stories span the arc of 100 years, going from the original description of the disease, maybe in the late 1890s, to maybe some breakthrough in the 1940s, to then another breakthrough in the 1980s, and so on. And you'll see that I think the biggest theme is that any molecule that gets approved has to get to the intersection of what I call biological understanding, clinical understanding, and technological advancement. And so think about a Venn diagram of these three circles, and you really have to get to the middle of that Venn diagram. And so, for example, from a biological understanding point of view, you need to understand what the target is, what it's doing, and how it's relevant to the disease. From a clinical understanding, then you need to understand, well, if I'm going after that target, which state or which part of the disease should I be going after, which will benefit patients. And then from the technology is, how do I even drug that target? And as you know, sometimes you just don't have a great technology to hit a target. There may be a great target, but you can't hit it. So you really need that technological component as well. And then that new technology also needs to be safe in humans.
Yes.
So I think those of us in drug development sometimes forget we may be just in one area or another area or the third area, but you really have to get to the middle of that Venn diagram.
I love that graphical representation of the Venn diagram, and I think it's so useful as a takeaway for everybody to just keep in mind and keep reminding themselves of that, and just have those components in awareness and check in, right? So, okay, so what do we have and what are we missing, and perhaps then how do we address that missing element? And then again, that concept of timing. Sometimes a molecule, as you've just said, has to wait for technology. So it doesn't mean that if it gets benched today, that it will never see the day, the time of day again. It may just need to wait for the right technology.
Right. And even when you have the right technology, you sometimes have to be, as I said, determined and resilient. There's one chapter in there on alpelisib, a molecule for breast cancer from Novartis, where basically they took 4 different molecules into clinic, and it was really only the 4th one that succeeded. And that's not uncommon either. Several of the other chapters highlight that, the first molecule in the clinic showed maybe proof of mechanism and proof of concept, but ultimately had some other issues necessitating that people go back to the lab, fix the molecule, and then come in with a second molecule.
The ultimate resiliency, really, in drug development and faith. And I feel that faith touches something beyond just the raw science as we know it. It really needs to be rooted in the passion and in that desire to make a difference and to help. And then also something that you've done the people developing these compounds such incredible justice in your book, and also touching upon the patients who trust to allow for the compounds to go into their bodies. As you said, it's not just an iPhone, it doesn't just go into your pocket, it actually goes into your body. And the sheer fact that every single drug that you described here and so many others, you've mentioned 1,800 approvals, there was always that first patient that received the drug, and we had no idea really how it was going to be tolerated or if it was going to work. Such incredible courage on the side of patients.
Yeah, I mean, the patients are obviously unsung heroes as well, particularly the early volunteers to go test new molecules. They may know that it may not benefit themselves. Hopefully it will benefit them, but ultimately will benefit future generations. So I really give, a lot of credit to all of the people who participate in trials. We couldn't make any advances without people like that.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I'm always humbled every time I consent a patient for a clinical trial. I'm so humbled every single time when they say yes, and because there's so much trust there.
Yeah, fully agree.
Yeah, and courage and vulnerability. I guess it doesn't go one without the other.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter what disease, right? It could be cancer, it could be an infectious disease. So really kudos to them. I think we'd write a whole other book on the unsung heroes in clinical trials.
So true. There's one chapter here. I feel that drug, like every single one of us has probably had it one time or another. You talk about paracetamol, and it's such an incredible story. I mean, I don't think there's a person who's going to be watching this and listening to this that hasn't had a headache and taken a paracetamol.
Right.
And I encourage everyone to just honestly read the whole book, but really, it's one of these things like we take it so often and we don't know how this came to life. It's such an incredible story. But given that we're talking about sharing progress in cancer care here, and there's more than one oncology drug depicted in your book, would you perhaps tell us a little story in a nutshell of one of those today for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we talk about osimertinib, which is a medicine, it's an epidermal growth factor receptor, or EGFR tyrosine kinase inhibitor, basically a small molecule for a subset of patients with lung cancer. Yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting story, one that I also was involved in as an academic. But I think the story really begins, with basic science discoveries. Back in the 1950s, when scientists were not interested in making a drug at all. They were just interested in answering questions about nature, which is, how do cells grow in the first place? This was back when we didn't understand a lot of fundamental principles about that. And Rita Levi-Montalcini and Stanley Cohen, who ended up winning the Nobel Prize, they were basically just asking, how do cells grow? And they ultimately discovered what are called growth factors, or substances in the body that ultimately make cells grow. And one of those factors they discovered was EGF, or epidermal growth factor, which is a factor that helps skin cells and gut cells and other cells in the body grow. So once they had that fundamental discovery, that there is a factor that makes cells grow, then the next question was, well, how does the factor actually tell cells to grow? And then it took like another 20 years to find what we call a receptor, meaning there's something on the outside of the cell that ultimately binds that factor and then stimulates the cell to grow. Then another 10 years later, people found out that that receptor can be overexpressed, or there can be too many of those receptors in cancer. And so that ultimately led to, hey, maybe this is a good target in cancer. But just like we were talking about, if you didn't have a technology to target that particular receptor, you couldn't make a drug. So then it wasn't until the 90s until that was even possible. So you can see just even in that short period of, not short, I guess 50 years, it took basic science discoveries and then ultimately a way to hit a target to bring some molecule into the clinic. Then, I probably won't go into all the detail of it, but essentially, even when people discovered those molecules and then brought them into the clinic for cancer, they didn't know where those molecules would work. And so, for example, since EGFR was thought to be expressed or overexpressed in a lot of cancers, the companies thought that they would work in lots of different cancers. But ultimately, when they went into humans, it only worked in 10% of lung cancer patients. And then we and others found, the genetic basis for that. It turned out that people had mutations in the epidermal growth factor gene that made them more sensitive. But those were not known when, people originally developed the first epidermal growth factor receptor, tyrosine kinase inhibitor. So there's a lot of accidental discovery too at the same time, which is also critical to drug development.
That's remarkable. It's interesting how these arcs of drug development work. Often it doesn't start with an intention to develop a drug, but from a basic scientific question and curiosity that ultimately leads to the drug.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether these drugs we use and talk about, and all the ones that are going to come through going forwards, it almost feels like somewhere these drugs already exist, and then they're just gifting us with this whole journey to ultimately sort of love them into existence, because there is so much love that it takes really so much love to birth a drug into existence. And every single one of these people, yourself included, and so many other unsung heroes, they really love what they do so much. every step of the way. Otherwise, I don't think any one of them would be there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what's interesting is I think there is a lot of, obviously, there's a lot of public sentiment about big pharma and big pharma potentially being bad and all that kind of stuff. But, I think in my book, I tried to highlight that there are people really dedicated to making a difference and making new medicines. And they have to harness the science and all of their knowledge, et cetera, and the passion that they have, as you mentioned. Particularly the passion is important because at the low points, you could give up and stop. But if you didn't, keep going, then you ultimately wouldn't get that medicine. I think in another chapter I talk about about a molecule called emicizumab, which is an antibody for hemophilia. That molecule took 10 years of preclinical discovery to even get into the clinic. And in there, the initial idea the scientists showed was possible. But then when they actually started testing it, it actually did the opposite of what they thought it should do. And then they were basically given like a deadline. You better get this fixed, by X date. Otherwise, we're killing the program. And they ultimately succeeded. But it was really because they had the passion and determination and got up every day excited to go to work to try to figure out what was going on and make a difference.
Exactly. And you talk about behind every drug, there is a story, bringing the human experience back into drug development. And that's exactly what you're doing in the book. And just like you've said, pharma can be perceived one way or the other. And the reality of that example, you better figure it out by such and such date, otherwise we're killing the program. We're faced with that more often than people think. But that passion and that belief that no, this is possible, we believe this will help people ultimately, is what gets us to meet those deadlines. So there's just such tremendous conviction and care.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Is there another chapter that you'd like to highlight some aspect of as well?
Well, I mean, I think I guess if we want to highlight one other chapter, it would be about CTX-001, which is the gene editing molecule approved in sickle cell, coming out from Vertex and CRISPR Therapeutics. And that's another very interesting story where, originally the description of sickle cell was in the 1920s. But then it wasn't until sort of the 1940s when Janet Watson observed that there might be something called fetal hemoglobin versus adult hemoglobin. I forgot to mention sickle cell disease is a disease, a genetic disorder where red blood cells are defective and can ultimately lead to sickling and pain and premature death. And it's really devastating for those who have it. And so people have tried to figure out how to treat it, right? It's ultimately a genetic disease, but haven't been able to treat it very well. And so when Janet Watson proposed the fact that there might be this form of hemoglobin, which is fetal hemoglobin, which is not affected by the sickling, then a lot of people were like, oh my God, how do we restore fetal hemoglobin in adults instead of having them have adult hemoglobin? So then basically since the 1970s or so, people have been working on them, like Stuart Orkin. And basically he and others worked for like 30 plus years and made a lot of other discoveries, but didn't ultimately figure out how to keep fetal hemoglobin expressed in human beings. And then it was something out of left field, an epidemiological genome-wide association study that made an association that ultimately identified a new gene called BCL11A that might be implicated in fetal hemoglobin persistence. And ultimately that discovery then led to, how do we actually then correct that? But even there, just like we were talking about, if you didn't have the technology, you couldn't do anything. But then that's in the early 2010s, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier discovered CRISPR, which is a gene editing procedure. And that ultimately led to then the ability to manipulate BCL11A. Now, it took another 10 years to get approved, but that's because, a company has to not only make the discovery on the molecule, but then they have to figure out how to scale it up and make it available worldwide and make it reliably reproducible and, manufactured in a safe way, so that every patient benefits and so on. So, that I think is also an underappreciated part of drug development. You can cure a mouse in the laboratory. You might be able to cure 1 or 2 patients in an academic setting, but ultimately, if you want to make an approved drug, it has to be scalable. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is from David Altshuler, who said it's like, building a bridge with Lego and then trying to build a bridge across the Hudson River. And I think people also underappreciate building that bridge across the Hudson takes a whole different set of skills and technologies and expertise. Again, by unsung heroes.
Such an important message, and another really fantastic graphical representation that people can go back to that visual, building a bridge with the Legos versus building a bridge across the Hudson, and really keep in mind what it takes to bring this drug, any drug, forward, not just in one country, but worldwide, to make it scalable, to make it safe, to make it reproducible, and to have it accessible also.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. It's really all the puzzle pieces coming together, and it's one big puzzle together.
Yeah, but it's fun. I think that's why a lot of us like to do it, right?
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
The rewards are absolutely amazing.
Yeah. So I think I would ask people next time they take a medicine just to remember, maybe all the people behind making that medicine possible. Of course, you can't remember all the names, but just remember that there might be like thousands of people who contributed to that particular pill that you're taking.
That's a really beautiful message. And it only takes a second sort of to internally say thank you to everyone who contributed to this drug being available to me today.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Chapter 9 says how to innovate. You told us 2 nuggets at the beginning. Is there perhaps one more that you would be willing to share, and then they can get the book and read the others?
Okay. Probably, just I mentioned it briefly, it's just serendipity.
Okay.
A lot of things come in from left field. And it's really important that people recognize that, there's things going on outside of their own area that may benefit them, and to stay on top of that as much as possible and to be open to new ideas. And sometimes those accidental discoveries or those discoveries coming in from left field really can make a huge difference. So, I didn't use the exact quote. Pasteur has a famous quote that luck is the residue of preparation. And also that chance favors the prepared mind. So you really need both of those in science and in drug development.
I love both of those messages. They're so incredible. And one would not necessarily put the word serendipity and the words drug development in the same sentence. But as you said, my experience as well is that they're inextricably connected, and that really fuels the entire journey with fun as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are you excited about going forwards?
Well, I think the pace of drug discovery is going to only accelerate. Some people have called this the biological century. And it's really true. I think our understanding of biology, our new technological advancements, they're all really rapidly advancing. Our understanding of the clinical situations and diseases is rapidly advancing. Now with machine learning and large language models and AI, and all of that will accelerate things. So I think this century we're going to see even more amazing new molecules coming and being approved in patients, which is great. I think it's going to be a benefit for humankind. And so I'm really excited to see what new molecules are coming down the pike.
It is a really promising prospect. Absolutely.
I mean, it's taken centuries for us to get to this point, but now I think we know a lot more on how to get things done. Certainly we can always improve the system and stuff, but it's definitely accelerating. And you can see that, I think, in one of the chapters, Paxlovid or nirmatrelvir, the molecule for COVID, that was developed in record time.
Right.
But the only way that was developed in record time was, the knowledge and the technology and the ability to get trials done quickly, was already there.
Exactly. It's one of those parallels of sitting on the shoulders of giants, just in the context of drug development and the drugs that we already have and all the lessons that we've learned along the way and all the technologies and advancements that have become available to us.
Yeah. So I'm excited to see what's coming.
Absolutely. So am I. And such a privilege to be a part of the times now. Absolutely. Yeah. So I would encourage all of the people who are watching and listening once again to get William's book, Breakthrough, The Quest for Life-Changing Medicines. It honestly is such an amazing set of stories put together by a brilliant mind, by a person who truly cares. And it's such an honor to be a colleague of yours in this space of drug development, truly. And I thank you for joining us today and sharing your story and sharing all of these stories in the book.
Thanks again, Alex, for the opportunity. It's great.
Absolutely. Thank you.